Blood on the Bayous is supported in part by Dr. B.B. Trotter from Abilene, Texas, and the Fort Butler Foundation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Don Frazier, and we're continuing our story of the American Civil War in Louisiana and Texas. Let's talk about the overall situation in the summer of 1863. Union arms have been defeated in Virginia, and the federal armies there are in retreat and in somewhat disarray. Politically, however, the federal government is starting to build its scaffolding, the framework through which it will finally and forever abolish slavery. The mechanisms are going to be three: First and Second Confiscation Acts, and also the Militia Act. The Confiscation Acts allow federal troops and other authorities to seize property from rebels, secessionists, people in rebellion against the federal government. This property will then be used to benefit the war effort. So if you have your plantation seized, the federal government calls it abandoned, it can then be leased to people coming in to operate your plantation for the benefit of the government. What that means then is that they can raise crops. Federal authorities, including the Army, will help market those crops to Union northern markets, and there may be some transaction fees that take place in the middle of all that. The Militia Act goes further in expanding what constitutes who is eligible to serve in the militia in the various federal states, the states that have remained in the Union. And this will broaden that interpretation to the point that you can start conscripting troops, conscripting individuals from states that are technically in rebellion but in the process of being brought back into the Union. This will also include liberated slaves. So the matrix is being formed, the scaffolding's being put into place, and there's another thing that's going on in the summer of 1863 which will have huge implications for the Civil War in Louisiana and Texas. That's the appointment of Henry Halleck as the General-in-Chief of all Union armies. He is not necessarily an original thinker, but he is certainly Lincoln's military incarnation. He is Lincoln's guy, and Halleck will do what the president says. Now, how does this play out in the situation in Louisiana? How does all of this impact the Pelican State? Well, Benjamin Butler is brilliant at using these new tools in his toolbox to essentially put the crimp on the secessionists in his region. And what he does is he says, you must show your loyalty to the federal government. Now, all of these pieces of legislation required that people take an oath of loyalty to prove that they are not, in fact, in rebellion. So the burden is actually on the people in these seceded states to say, that's not me, that's those other people. And so Butler says, yeah, that's certainly going to be the case here. And if you don't come into New Orleans and sign up pretty fast, then bad things may happen to your property. We may kind of go on a shopping expedition. And what we will do is we will go through and we will take your stuff. Now, interestingly, abolitionists argued that slaves were people. But when it comes to the Confiscation Act, they're property. And so when federal authorities visit these abandoned plantations, part of what they may run off are the slaves. So now they are going to be emancipated slaves and well within federal control. What does that mean? Well, that means that they're now liable to be put to work on behalf of the federal government. So Butler is very clear on how he's going to dismantle slavery wherever he can. One of his officers, a man from Maine, Captain Godfrey, who was in charge of helping to arrange the recruitment of Louisianans and foreigners into new regiments for Butler's army, was amazed at how skillful Butler was. He said, "I could find quite a number of flaws in him, but one thing is certain. There's not a governor of a state or a general in the army that has done so much towards abolition as he." Yeah, in fact, Butler's kind of going even beyond where the Confiscation Acts had been and where the Militia Act was going, and was really gathering momentum in southern Louisiana. The effects were absolutely electric throughout the state. Another one of Butler's officers, General Williams, who we talked about being killed at the Battle of Baton Rouge, before his passing, made the following observation. Said, "These Southerners began the war to establish a great slave empire. They must stop the rebellion to save their country from destruction and servile war, and perhaps Negro domination and a black republic." What a terrible punishment. So if the Confederates do not come to their senses, then what's going to end up happening is their worst fears will be realized. Their slaves will be weaponized against them, and then they may actually rule over them in a post-war world. Well, how does this play out then amongst the secessionists in Louisiana? Well, Governor Moore understands that everything he's done up to this point has largely backfired. By trying to project Confederate power into the Sugar Parishes to put some sort of veneer of Confederate protection over that great swath of territory up and down Bayou LaForce has just gone nowhere fast. And in fact, the locals there are starting to resent Confederate interventions to the point where they arrest Confederate officers that are causing trouble, things like that. So Moore backs up, brings his units back out of that region where he needs to, but keeps them all on a short leash. And then begins to do things that try to win the hearts and the minds of the people of that region. First thing he does is he builds Confederate societies, essentially trying to win Confederate loyalty or win the loyalty of these people to a Confederate cause that they may not be 100% on board with. Another thing he does is he starts to build relief efforts, gathering funds, putting forth measures to relieve the suffering of the people that are being dispossessed by the federal government or who have young men, the husbands, brothers, things like that are off at war and are no longer in a position to provide for their family. The Confederacy also responds at long last. The first thing that happens is Confederate politicians look for an officer that will go and retrieve the situation in Louisiana. There's one obvious choice. That would be Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the great Creole general of New Orleans. He has been, cantankerous to say the least, and has had a career that has been somewhat vitriolic. Even so, what a natural guy, currently unemployed within the Confederate effort, what a natural choice, perfect fellow to send back to Louisiana. So they ask him, "What do you think, General Beauregard?" And his response is very diplomatic. "Of course, I should be proud and happy to drive from my native state the abolitionists who are now desecrating its soil. We can retake New Orleans, but we cannot hold it without subjecting it to destruction." He went on to say that even if New Orleans had been taken, that it would not give the Confederates control of any of the Mississippi any more than they had already. So why have the city destroyed just for the sake of taking it? So he politely says, "No, thank you. I will not go." The Confederates then look around for another unemployed Louisianan, and they settle on Richard Taylor, a planter before the war with extensive holdings in St. Charles Parish. Now, Richard Taylor was an interesting subject. He had gone to war with the first rush of the secessionist fervor, commanded a brigade of Louisianans under Stonewall Jackson in Stonewall Jackson's army, and operated in the Shenandoah Valley, where he took very careful notice of how his boss fought. He was highly mobile, Jackson was. His army was always on the move. And Taylor understood the benefits and the great advantage that could be held if you kept the enemy guessing as to your intentions. Problem is, Taylor was somewhat fragile, and the Shenandoah campaign of 1862 broke him and landed him in the hospital. So the war moved on without him. But when he recovered, turns out he was the right guy at the right time to send to Louisiana. He arrives in Alexandria, and on August 20th makes his first pronouncement: I am heading down south, and I'm going to drive the enemy from the Sugar Parishes. Now, he had a personal stake in this. Taylor was a family man. He had 3 girls, 2 boys, and a very wealthy holding in St. Charles Parish. And he wanted to go back and literally liberate his own home. There was one obstacle to this, and he wrote home explaining it. He said, I am almost disheartened by the want of patriotic feeling here. They are unwilling to do anything to defend themselves. In the lower part of the state, this feeling is almost universal. Clearly, Richard Taylor was going to have his work cut out for him if he was going to keep Louisiana in the Confederacy.